Berserk has come a long way since its incarnation back in 1989. It's become a deeply touching story about the horrific realities of life and how people have the ability to persevere and recover even from the worst situations. It's a story about struggling against what the fates seem determined to make you do, and about how a love between two people can keep even the darkest flames away from one another. About how pushing through difficult and unrelenting darkness can often lead you to something more wonderful on the other end. Almost everything about Berserk has changed since its beginning, from the art style to the characters it focuses on, and of course Guts' development from Black Swordsman loner to being a source of leadership and inspiration for those around him. But when thinking about Berserk as a whole, as a complete story, we must include everything, and that includes, yes, even this. But now that the story has come so far, it might be interesting to look back and wonder how well the first story arc, the Black Swordsman arc, holds up compared to the entirety of the manga. It's no secret that when creating the Black Swordsman arc, Kentaro Miura went into it with only a vague idea of what he wanted the story to be. He didn't know he was going to be including the Band of the Hawk, that there would be a romance between Guts and Casca, or how exactly Guts wound up in the situation that he finds himself in when we begin his journey. Remember that Berserk was created and first released in the late 80s, and a lot of the style and tone of its beginnings are inspired by media of that time that Miura was a fan of. And I always find it very interesting to see the things that inspired people that we look up to as great artists, and it kind of humbles us to remember that every creator is inspired by the ones that came before them. As for its manga inspirations, a lot of the creepier and more horrific-centric aspects were of course inspired by Devilman. Not limited to how Devilman has concepts of humans merging with devils, not quite the same as an apostle, but the basic concept of humans embracing their evil and becoming monsters is there. You also have the juxtaposition of the main character looking like a dark and demonic entity, while the antagonist is more like a glowing, elegant savior. Lucifer is the Lord of Light after all, and even as Berserk advances, it keeps the concept of Griffith projecting himself as a religious-like savior of humanity. A book series called Gwyn Saga helped to inspire a lot of the fantasy elements within the story and the way that a lot of the foundations of what the world would look and feel like. And of course, there was Fist of the North Star, an 80s manga that went on to be a famous piece of fiction in itself and one of the OG shonen experiences. And even that took a lot of inspiration from the Mad Max films. And I swear, everything comes back to Mad Max. It's crazy. I would argue these movies are one of the most important pieces of cinema because so much came from them. But that's a story for another video. Essentially, Fist of the North Star took the concept of the post-apocalyptic world where society had crumbled and what was left of humanity is fighting to survive and thrive within a world without law or rules. Gangs rule the land and the weak are subjugated. But then you have Kenshiro, a huge muscle-bound martial arts warrior who travels the land alone and fights on behalf of those who can't. His strength and skill often absolutely dominating all of his opponents. And there's a lot of tie-ins to Fist of the North Star, not just that Miura would work with the creator himself and even drew some manga for him, but also the design and look of Guts himself. He's a staple of the time period of Fist of the North Star, that lone warrior traveling from town to town fighting powerful enemies that threaten evil and destruction. Huge, strong, and able to face the threats that nobody else can dream of standing up to. In the prototype of Berserk, Guts meets a small girl that, yeah, looks like a mini Griffith, but she's actually very nice, I swear. Anyways, this dynamic is very similar again to Fist of the North Star, with Kenshiro meeting a small girl named Rin early on in that manga. And we also have a lot of other various 80s action and horror movie influences at the time. During the 80s, we had guys like Sylvester Stallone, Jean-Claude Van Damme, and Arnold Schwarzenegger that were our heroes in movies, and they were all very jacked, masculine, and just had some massive balls.
Because I'm a stud. I'm ballsy. I don't take no shit from anyone. I smoke my stogie anywhere I want. I don't have to find a hideout place like you.
And on the horror side, there was also a heavy influence from the God Hand that make their first appearance in this arc from the Cenobites of the Hellraiser film. Void, looking like he was tortured, is very similar to the lead Cenobite, also known as Pinhead. There's also one female Cenobite, one female in the God Hand, and Butterball and Conrad, well, they're the token fat guy of the group. There's also the implement of a mystical device that grants you an audience with them. In Hellraiser, it's the puzzle box, and in Berserk, it's the Beylet. And just the general mystique and feeling of these characters, that larger-than-life, ultra-powerful presence like they've seen so many things over their hundreds of years of existence. Their connection to a terrifying hellscape, it's all there, it's all the building blocks and the ideas that Miura was playing with at the time. But with all this being said, does that make the early stages of Berserk just some product of its time, or does it work completely within the entirety of the manga? So yes, it's fair to say the Black Swordsman arc of Berserk has a lot of edgy 80s flair to it. It throws you headfirst into this dark, chaotic, violent world, where Guts' gigantic sword slices enemies in half and their insides go flying everywhere. We begin the manga with Guts as a wandering demon slayer that doesn't seem to care about anyone or anything that gets in his way. You could also look at this as taking the opposite approach of Kenshiro from Fist of the North Star. Where Kenshiro is very heroic, Guts just seems to not give a shit. But then we have the character of Puck, an adorable little elf with empathic abilities that can feel this pain and despair coming from Guts, and Puck originally served as this sort of vessel for the audience, a character within the story that would ask Guts the questions that we, the audience, wanted to know. And I think that Miura did something very incredibly unique here, in that even without knowing what Guts' backstory was going to be, there are still so many clues that he would eventually write into the rest of the story. In fact, I think I'm most impressed by how few plot holes there actually are, considering he was writing it this way. Guts is haunted by a strange demonic-looking creature that Miura would eventually write into the story as being his offspring. Guts has a small nuanced moment where you start to see the persona of the Black Swordsman slip away, and he feels general sympathy and remorse for the way that things have become. The fact that Miura ended the arc with Guts falling into tears was a brilliant setup for the tragic backstory that we would get next. If Berserk would have stayed within the confines of the Black Swordsman arc and what it was doing, then you might have an argument that it could have become dated or even boring over time if it was just a Monster of the Month style format. But the fact that the Black Swordsman arc only lasts as long as it does sets up the world and the questions that need answers, and then expands from there, makes it a much more special piece of the puzzle in an otherwise simplistic dark manga. The very fact that the story and Guts' character grows and evolves so much from this opening only adds to the benefit of the overall narrative, rather than it just becoming a repetitive piece of fiction. The Black Swordsman arc also lays a ton of groundwork for the lore of the world Berserk takes place in. Not only does it show us a cold, unforgiving medieval-style world, but before the Golden Age flashback, we completely understand the process of apostles and what they are, because of the Count being our first primary antagonist. We get his complete backstory when the God Hand arrives. We understand that when reaching a peak of desperation and despair, a Beylet activates for those it's fated to be with. From there, they receive an audience with the God Hand and must make a choice to sacrifice something that they hold precious in order to receive extreme power. But even after that, we know that the person is still roughly who they were before, but with their own personal evil and darkness amplified. We also get the understanding of their ability to create pseudo-apostles. We see this through the most tragic character of all time, Zondark. That poor man. Make sure you check out my Zondark video for more info on that. But the Count still was able to care about his daughter and still held on to enough humanity to refuse to sacrifice her. So we also learn what happens when an apostle dies, and how anyone caught up with demonkind are pulled into this abyss. It's translated as hell within the English volumes, and more or less that could be correct. It's a swirling vortex of torment and misery that exists for seemingly eternity. When you are pulled in, your consciousness is slowly ripped away, and all that will be left is just a feeling of pain and darkness that continues on forever. Your individuality is gone, and all that is left is that feeling. It's such a gigantic piece of the puzzle of the story and the lore, and it's all right there within the finale of the very first short story arc. and it's all remained consistent throughout the entire manga. Rosine was similar to the Count in having feelings for her friend Jill. With Wild's death, we saw him pulled into the abyss, and sure, Miura would expand on this over time, but it's great to see the general concept of this collected consciousness of darkness, and those who die under the connection of demonic entities or with restless or tormented lives would all collect en masse and contribute to the greater overall evil within the story of Berserk. There are also aspects here that help enhance the Golden Age arc that comes next. Since we already know what a Beylit is and what it does, when we see Griffith with one, and knowing that he will eventually become Femto, it creates this looming sense of dread and unease throughout the whole arc, because we know that at any time something horrible is going to happen. Sure, the God Hand transformation is a bit different and definitely more intense than an Apostle 1, but we already get the gist of what it's all about. It might be an odd term to use for something so violent and chaotic, but I think there is a charm to the Black Swordsman arc that works both as a product of its time, so it's a fun and nostalgic thing to look back on, but it also helps complement so much of what comes after that it really only enhances everything else. It can be looked at as its own little pocket story, but put together with everything else, it's a necessary component to the entire narrative. And I like to be able to look at all the little details and influence from other media and how Miura made it all his own and expanded it into a story that many of us would call our favorite. Something that will never truly be able to be replicated, and a manga that has continued to inspire and motivate us to persevere even in the most dominating of situations. I love the Black Swordsman arc for all its simplicity and all its complexity. It's a necessary component of the Berserk story, and if it's been a while since you've read it, it might be worth revisiting just to remind ourselves of how far we've really come.